Hello, everyone. My name is Mark. I'm part of the Mark and Matt Sports Talk Show, and we're here with the special guest today, Randy Hahn, announcer of the San Jose Sharks. And Randy, how have you been doing this today?
Today, I'm doing great. Enjoying the holiday season. Hope the same has been for you and everybody watching.
Yes. This has been a very rough year with this COVID-19 pandemic. But Randy, before we get into the hockey questions, we just wanted to ask you a couple questions. First being, how did you become an announcer for the San Jose Sharks?
It goes back to the late 1980s. I was working for the Los Angeles Kings, doing their pre-game, post-game, and intermissions on TV. And at the same time, I was living in the San Jose area and commuting to do the Kings broadcasts. And I formed an organization with a couple of attorneys called Pro Hockey San Jose. And we were attempting to, basically develop a season ticket base list if the NHL were ever to come to the Bay Area. Then we were fortunate enough to hook up with some people who wanted to pursue the opportunity of owning an expansion franchise in San Jose. And long story short, by the time that all came together in 1991, the Sharks' first season, I was hired to do a portion of the games. The Sharks' first TV play-by-play announcer was Joe Starkey, a very famous Bay Area voice. At that time, he was the voice of the San Francisco 49ers on radio, and he also did football and basketball play-by-play for Cal. And they hired him to be the Sharks' first TV announcer, but because of his other commitments, he couldn't do all the games. So about 15 games a season the first 2 years, I was hired to do those games. And then in year 3, Joe stepped aside as his schedule was just too busy to try and do all of those different teams. And I started doing the team full time since the 93-94 season, which of course was the great season when the Sharks eliminated Detroit in the first round and kind of shocked the hockey world. So that's the condensed version of how I came to be the Sharks announcer.
Interesting. I've been watching the Sharks for a very long time, and the Sharks have always been a very competitive hockey team. And this past season, unfortunately, due to COVID-19, the season was sadly cut short. I wanted to ask you, with the NHL season right around the corner, we've heard a lot of rumors and speculations of about the number of games being played. Usually there's an 82 game schedule in the regular season, but there's been rumors of those games being condensed and the divisions being changed. Can you confirm to us what you know about what changes are going to be taking place this season?
Well, we do know that there will be a realignment of the divisions, and that's primarily to keep all the Canadian teams together in Canada, because one of the biggest challenges for playing in the NHL is crossing the border into Canada and back and forth. And right now, I believe it's a 10 to 14 day quarantine that's mandatory if you're coming from the US into Canada. So that would make it impossible for the league to conduct normal business with the Sharks, for example, traveling up to Vancouver and then coming home and playing a few games, then going up to Edmonton and Calgary and playing a few. It's just not practical. So the Sharks will be in a Pacific kind of division, although St. Louis will also be in that division, and Minnesota, and they're a long way from the Pacific Ocean, but it's more regionalized. All the California teams, the two I just mentioned, Colorado, Vegas, Arizona, and that'll make up the division that the Sharks will play in. They'll play in a 56 game season. At least that's the plan right now. I think they've left some wiggle room in the schedule if there's some games that have to be postponed or rescheduled due to positive COVID tests, because I think it's unrealistic to think that there won't be any. There will be some, because this is not a bubble like the playoffs were last fall. This is a different scenario. So hopefully we get all 56 games in. That'll end at the beginning of May. And then the Stanley Cup playoffs will begin around May 8th or 10th. And hopefully the Sharks are still playing then.
Yes, I agree, Randy. The Sharks made a lot of moves this offseason, and just to name a few, they traded for Dubnyk this offseason, a goaltender from the Minnesota Wild. They re-signed Patrick Marleau as well. Sadly let Joe Thornton go, who was a favorite Shark of mine, always has been. And they signed Kevin Dubnyk to a 4-year deal. And Randy, in your opinion, do you feel like that with these moves, do you feel like the Sharks are going to be a playoff team this year, or do you feel like they're going to be maybe rebuilding or retooling this for maybe future seasons?
Well, I think if they are rebuilding or retooling, it's for this season. I don't think Doug Wilson, the general manager, has in mind a strip down. The Sharks have too many locked in contracts to do something like that. And I'm not sure that, this marketplace would accept a Sharks team that didn't make the playoffs for 3 or 4 years while they retooled. That's a hard sell, even in the strongest of hockey environments, like a place like Toronto. They survived it there. It looks like they may be going through that again in Chicago, and we'll keep a close eye on the attendance as they continue rebuilding. I don't think that's what the plan is in San Jose. I think the Sharks intend to contend for a playoff spot this year. And I think if, number one, if the goaltending improves, and it was near the bottom of the NHL last year, and Martin Jones and Devin Dubnyk, with their respective teams, Jones with the Sharks and Dubnyk with the Wild last year, had some of the poorest stats among any starting goaltenders in the league last year, to the point where at the end of the Minnesota season, Dubnyk lost his starting job to Alex Stalock, the former Shark. So I think the goaltending has to shore up. They have to do a much better job in the net. I've always compared it to non-hockey fans of the goaltender in hockey is the quarterback in football. If you have a good one, you have a chance to contend for a playoff spot. If you have a great one, you have a chance to win a Super Bowl. But if you have an average one, you're in trouble. And I think the Sharks goaltending last year was average at best. And it showed where they finished in the standings at the bottom of the Pacific Division. So number one, that has to improve. And I think the defensive play in front of those goaltenders, which was one of the Sharks' strengths in the Pete DeBoer era, but started to tail off near the end of DeBoer's time as head coach, that has to be reestablished. And they certainly have the players to do it on the back end, like Erik Karlsson and Marc-Edouard Vlasic, and Brent Burns, Mario Ferraro, to name four right there, Radim Šimić. But it's also a team game. It's not just the defensemen who play defense. The whole team has to be better at keeping the puck out of their net. But it starts with the goalies, and they have to be much, much better, or the Sharks won't make the playoffs.
Yes, I agree with you, Randy. But let me ask you just a question. Do you think the Sharks brought in Devin Dubnyk to maybe push Martin Jones? Because not too long ago, Martin Jones did lead the Sharks to a Stanley Cup Finals appearance. And so the Sharks have never been to a Stanley Cup Finals. And so do you think that Doug Wilson made this move maybe to push Martin Jones, or do you think Devin Dubnyk's going to be the starter heading into opening day?
It wasn't that long ago that Devin Dubnyk was a Vezina Trophy finalist as the best goalie in the NHL with the Wild. He had a bad year. He had some personal issues off the ice with his wife being very ill, and I'm sure that we can all relate to the fact that if you were dealing with that mentally, at arguably the most important mental position in hockey, that would affect your year. So I think the hope is that Dubnyk and Jones will fight it out. I don't know that it's Dubnyk pushing Jones necessarily. It might be Jones pushing Dubnyk. If it works out the way the Sharks hope it will, you'll have two competitors battling one another. And even if one emerges as number one and the other emerges as number two, however that order presents itself once the season gets underway, both goalies are going to play a lot. Even though there's 56 games, I think the Sharks have 13 or 14 back-to-back scenarios within that. Their travel is going to be crazy because they're going to start the season playing their home games in Arizona, not in San Jose. So it's going to be an unusual year for sure for all teams, but especially for the Sharks, who can't play in their home building, SAP Center, as of now. So I think both goaltenders are going to be relied upon a lot. And it might be a situation where in the past, your backup goalie maybe only played 15 to 20% of your games. This year, it might be more like 30 or maybe even 40% of your games. So the situation maybe will not be the traditional starter and backup. They may end up emerging as co-starters. We'll just have to wait and see.
So more of a 50-50 split possibly. Would you say too that also, because we also know Logan Couture was out for most of the season last year, would you say that Logan Couture coming back also helps the Sharks?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the Sharks finished last regular season with no Couture, no Hurdle, no Eric Carlson. So those are three pretty important players for the franchise. And I'm not saying that it was just because they were hurt near the end that the Sharks didn't make the playoffs. They had issues all year long, and they had injury issues all year long, but they had probably deeper chemistry issues in the locker room and on the ice. And, we'll see how those things sort themselves out. Everybody ought to be healthy. Hopefully, fingers crossed, they have an injury-free training camp that'll start in a few days. And they can get back on track. As Bob Boughner, the new head coach, said, probably the best thing is that they're going to be going through training camp in kind of a lockdown environment in Arizona, and then start the season as a group. So they'll have 2 or 3 weeks where they will be kind of in their own bubble. And Boughner is hopeful that that's what it'll take to bring this group together off the ice so that they look more together on the ice.
Those are very interesting points you bring up there, Randy. Last one about the Sharks. Do you feel that, because they brought back Patrick Marleau this season, for you personally, was it a bittersweet moment to see Patrick Marleau come back, but to see Joe Thornton leave?
Well, for sure. They're iconic players in the history of the franchise, and the Sharks have yet to retire a jersey in their history to the rafters. And if and when they decide to do that, it's probably going to be one of those two guys who goes up first. And my guess it would be Patrick Marleau to go up first. Who knows? They might decide to put them up together depending on when they retire. But it was tough to see Joe go. But I think Joe wanted a shot to win a Stanley Cup. He wanted a shot at the trade deadline last year, and it just didn't work out. So now he's got his chance. He's with a Toronto team that has a lot of talent. And we'll see. Maybe they have a better shot at winning a Stanley Cup than the Sharks do. But strange things happen once the games start getting played. So we'll see how it all unfolds. But it's great for Joe to get this opportunity. He's going back home to Southern Ontario to play in front of family and friends. I'm sure that means a lot to him as well. And for his children to see him play in that environment, that's a big thing too. And for Patrick, I think San Jose will be home after hockey. His wife is from here. His children were all born here. They have deep roots in the Bay Area. So it's great to have Patrick back, and hopefully he can stay healthy for enough games to pass Gordie Howe's all-time record during this season. I think he needs 45 games to do it, and he's been such an Iron Man as far as being able to stay healthy and play consistently. Hopefully that continues, and we can celebrate that later in the year.
Yes, I totally agree. Patrick Marleau and Joe Thornton will always be remembered as San Jose Sharks. Let me ask something, just a question for you, Randy. What is your most memorable Sharks game that you have ever announced?
Well, there's two things: most memorable moment and most memorable game. And for years, and I'll still maintain that the biggest goal scored in Sharks history was by my broadcast partner, former now, who's stepped aside, Jamie Baker, who scored the winning goal in Game 7 in Detroit in 1994 in one of the biggest upsets in NHL playoff history, when the Sharks knocked off the number 1 seeded and favorites to win the Cup that year, the Detroit Red Wings. For me, that's the biggest goal, biggest moment. And for many, many years, it was, in my mind, the biggest game. But I think Game 7 against the Vegas Golden Knights 2 seasons ago, and the incredible late comeback, and there you go, and then the winning goal by Barclay Goodrow in overtime. For me, I've never been, let alone at a bigger game. I've done World Cup soccer games in Italy and in the US and some big ones, but I've never been at a sporting event of that magnitude as it turned out. So that'll be my biggest game in Sharks history. And I don't know that anything will knock that off the pedestal until we watch the Sharks clinch the Stanley Cup.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's funny because I was watching that game that night, and when the Sharks were down 3-0 in the third quarter, I was like, oh, we're going to lose again. But once, sadly, when Joe Pavelski got hurt and they saw the Sharks were scoring on the power play, I could not, like, me and my father, my brother, who are big hockey fans as well, we could not believe that the Sharks came back from such a large deficit. And I totally agree. It's probably one of the greatest hockey games I personally have ever seen. And I've watched a lot of hockey. And so, that I think will forever go down as one of the greatest Shark games I think I've personally, or any sports games for that matter of fact. So, Randy, we appreciate your time. We thank you for answering the questions that we have. We know that this has been a very difficult year. We thank you for your patience and for working out with us. It was such a pleasure to ask questions to an announcer. You know, it's always been my dream to interview an announcer or a sports player. And so thank you for hopping on and answering the questions today.
My pleasure, Mark. Happy New Year. And I know Sharks fans everywhere look forward to January 14th and the season opener on NBC Sports California. Thanks.
Yes, exciting. Can't wait. Go Sharks.